In the last lecture module, we looked at Skinner's argument for why it was his particular brand of behaviorism, his functional analysis approach, was the way he thought that psychologists should approach psychology. In this module, we're going to turn our attention to Chomsky's criticisms of verbal behavior in his review of the book. Chomsky organizes his criticisms of Skinner into 3 different topics, each related to a question. The first question, what is being related? The second question, what relation is being asserted? And the third question, how is that relation brought about? And Chomsky will claim that in each case, Skinner's behaviorism cannot offer a scientifically acceptable answer. In the case of language learning and use. Let's turn to that first question then. As concerns language learning and use, Skinner is going to want to explain language use and acquisition in terms of relationships that are created between classes of stimuli and classes of response via operant conditioning. And Chomsky notes that, look, there are 2 ways that we can determine what counts as a stimulus class or response class. And each of these ways, he claims, has problems that look insurmountable. So the basic schema will be that we'll have these classes of linguistic stimuli, that whenever those stimuli come up, there's a probability that you'll give the following linguistic response. But in order to make this schema work, you have to be able to classify linguistic behavior in terms of stimuli and response. And so this is the first problem that Chomsky calls to our attention. Chomsky notes that if you give a wide definition of what counts as the same stimulus or the same response, wide definitions tend to let in so much that what counts as the same stimuli or response makes it almost useless to try and formulate any meaningful predictive or explanatory laws. So if we're exposed to, say, this 3-eyed fish here, and all of these different responses all count as the same response, well, that doesn't seem like it's going to be very useful for prediction, control, explanation of linguistic use or linguistic behavior. Now, if we try to come up with a narrower definition, Chomsky notes that narrower definitions generate difficulty because how we go about narrowing it is going to have to be consistent with the generalizations that we make from one case to the next. So that we want to come up with a formulation of a stimulus or response class that captures all of the behaviors that would elicit a particular response, or all of the responses that would be categorized as being the same linguistic response. So the difficulty here really lies with what counts as the same class here. Does a slight orientation shift, a change in lighting? What causes something to be the same or different? And this is a general problem for behaviorists, but it's particularly difficult when it comes to understanding and explaining linguistic acquisition and use. And Chomsky tells us that Skinner skirts the problem, offering only metaphorical extensions of the standard theoretical terms that makes them, in Chomsky's words, no more scientific than the traditional approaches to the subject matter, and rarely as clear and careful. Chomsky gives a very poignant characterization of language that really emphasizes the difficulty with this problem of specifying stimuli and response. Page 56 of the review, he says, we constantly read and hear new sequences of words, recognize them as sentences, and understand them. The new events that we accept and understand as sentences are not related to those with which we are familiar by any simple notion of formal or semantic or statistical similarity, or by identity of grammatical frame. Talk of generalization in this case is entirely pointless and empty. It appears that we recognize a new item as a sentence not because it matches some familiar item in any simple way, but because it is generated by the grammar that each individual has somehow and in some form internalized. What about the relationship itself? Well, here Chomsky finds things to be just as dire. For Skinner, our stimulus and response classes are related to response strength, which Skinner defines as probability of a response. However, Skinner evokes a confused notion of probability and allows additional factors to contribute to response strength. And Chomsky then concludes that Skinner's extrapolation of the notion of probability can at best be interpreted as, in effect, nothing more than the decision to use the word probability with its favorable connotations of objectivity. So in effect, Chomsky's criticism here is that the mechanisms of operant conditioning really don't provide you with a way of predicting or explaining the likelihood of a response given a stimulus, even when you can specify the classes that are supposed to be related to the stimulus-response pairings. Finally, how does that relationship get created between stimulus and response? Skinner does make it very clear that, in his view, reinforcement is a necessary condition for language learning and for the continued availability of linguistic responses in the adult. However, the looseness of the term reinforcement, as Skinner uses it in the book under review, makes it entirely pointless to inquire into the truth or falsity of this claim. It can be seen that the notion of reinforcement has totally lost whatever objective meaning it may ever have had. Running through these examples, we see that a person can be reinforced though he emits no response at all, and that the reinforcing stimulus need not impinge upon the reinforced person, nor need even exist. It is sufficient that it be imagined or hoped for. So ultimately, Chomsky suggests that response strength as well as reinforcement are not effectively operationalized, that they don't in fact lead to the formulation of dynamic hypotheses between well-specified stimuli and response, and that the project itself looks hopelessly mired in difficulties. In the next lecture, we'll turn our attention to the extraction of general criticisms and limitations that emerge for behaviorism and that help to place the appropriate role of the phenomenon that behaviorists have discovered and carefully studied in a larger context of human and animal behavior.